The morning mist clung to the water like smoke when she first heard the crying echoing from the limestone caverns that honeycombed the riverbank. Two voices, high and desperate, calling out in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. Meant help. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What she pulled from those dark waters would change everything, not just for her, but for two worlds that had been at war for longer than anyone could remember. The Texas sun had barely crested the horizon when Margaret Henderson guided her horse down the narrow trail that led to the river crossing. The year was 1847, and the settlement of Cedar Ridge sat like a stubborn thumbprint on the vast canvas of what most folks still called Indian Territory. Margaret had made this journey countless times, carrying supplies between the settlement and the trading post 15 miles downstream, but something felt different about this particular morning. The air hung thick with an unusual stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Even her mare, Duchess, seemed more cautious than usual, her ears twitching at sounds Margaret couldn't hear. The limestone bluffs that flanked the river cast long shadows across the water, creating pockets of darkness that seemed to shift and move with a life of their own. Margaret was 23 years old, with the kind of practical strength that came from growing up on the frontier. Her father, Samuel Henderson, had been one of the first settlers to establish a homestead in this part of Texas, carving out a life from land that others said was too dangerous to claim. The Comanche had made their displeasure known through raids and skirmishes, but Samuel Henderson was not a man easily deterred. Neither was his daughter. She had learned to ride before she could properly walk, could shoot a rifle with deadly accuracy by the age of 12, and possessed an intuitive understanding of the wilderness that seemed to flow in her blood. Her mother, Mary, had died when Margaret was 16, leaving her to manage the household and help her father with the daily challenges of frontier life. She had grown comfortable with solitude, finding peace in the wild spaces that frightened most people. As the Duchess picked her way down the rocky slope toward the water's edge, Margaret's attention was caught by something unusual. The normal. Sounds of the river, the gentle lapping of water against stone, the rustle of cottonwood leaves in the breeze were punctuated by something else, something that made her pull up short and strain her ears to listen. Crying. Definitely crying. But unlike anything she had heard before, it wasn't the distressed call of an animal, nor the sound of wind through the rock formations. These were human voices, she was certain, but they seemed to be coming from somewhere impossible, from within the limestone bluffs themselves. Margaret dismounted and secured Duchess to a sturdy mesquite bush, then approached the riverbank with careful steps. The crying grew more distinct as she moved closer to the water. Two voices, she realized, both young, both desperate. They seemed to be echoing from somewhere within the network of caves that riddled the cliffs along this stretch of the Brazos. She had explored some of these caves as a child, despite her father's warnings about getting lost in the maze of tunnels that extended deep into the earth. Local legends spoke of underground rivers and chambers that connected to caverns miles away, but Margaret had always assumed such stories were exaggerated. Now, listening to those plaintive voices, she wondered if perhaps the old tales contained more truth than she had imagined. The sound seemed strongest near a cluster of boulders at the base of the bluff, where the river had carved a small inlet over countless years. Margaret clambered over the rocks, following the sound, until she found herself standing before what appeared to be nothing more than a narrow crack in the stone face. But as she leaned closer, she could feel air moving through the opening, and the voices were definitely coming from somewhere beyond. Without hesitation, Margaret began working to widen the opening, using her hands and the knife from her belt to clear away loose stones and debris. The gap was barely wide enough for her to squeeze through, but she managed to work her way into what revealed itself to be a tunnel that sloped downward into darkness. The crying was much clearer now, and Margaret could tell it was coming from somewhere ahead, deeper in the cave system. She had no torch, but enough light filtered through the entrance behind her to illuminate the first few yards of the passage. Moving carefully, feeling her way along the rough walls, she progressed deeper into the tunnel. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and Margaret could hear the sound of moving water somewhere in the darkness ahead. The voices were very close now, and she called out, her words echoing strangely in the enclosed space. "Hello? Can you hear me? I'm here to help." The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by what sounded like whispered conversation in a language Margaret didn't understand. Then one voice called out, speaking English with a heavy accent that made the words difficult to understand. "Please, we are trapped. The water rises." Margaret pressed forward, guided now by the sound of the voices and the increasing noise of rushing water. The chamber she entered was partially flooded, with water flowing through from some underground source. In the dim light that filtered down from an opening far above, she could make out two small figures clinging to a rocky ledge just above the waterline. Children, two children, both appearing to be around 8 or 9 years old, with dark hair and clothes that marked them as different from anyone in Cedar Ridge. Even in the poor light, Margaret could see they were exhausted and terrified. "How long have you been here?" she called out as she waded into the cold water toward them. "2 days," one of them answered, a boy whose voice shook with cold and fear. "Maybe 3. We cannot tell in the dark." As Margaret reached them, she could see they were twins, a boy and a girl who looked remarkably similar despite their different clothes. The boy wore buckskin leggings and a shirt decorated with beadwork, while the girl was dressed in a simple dress that had once been white but was now stained with mud and cave water. "I'm Margaret," she said, reaching up to help them down from their precarious perch. "What are your names?" The boy looked at his sister before answering. "I am Joseph. This is my sister Anna." Margaret noticed their hesitation, the way they glanced at each other as if confirming a story they had agreed upon. These were not their real names, she realized, but she didn't press the issue. What mattered now was getting them to safety. "Can you swim?" she asked. Both children shook their heads, and Margaret could see the fear in their eyes as they looked at the dark water that filled much of the chamber. The water level did indeed seem to be rising, fed by whatever underground source kept this hidden river system flowing. "Don't worry," Margaret said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "I'll get you out of here." She studied the chamber, looking for the best route to safety. The way she had entered was too narrow and too far above the current water level for her to help the children navigate. But she could see another opening in the cave wall, one that seemed to lead toward the river outside. If she could find a way through that passage, they might be able to reach the main river and swim to safety. "We're going to go that way," she said, pointing toward the opening. "Stay close to me, and if the water gets too deep, hold on to my shoulders. Do you understand?" Both children nodded, though Margaret could see the terror in their eyes. Joseph, the boy, seemed to be trying to be brave for his sister's sake, while Anna clung to him with obvious desperation. Margaret led them into the water, moving carefully across the uneven floor of the flooded chamber. The current was stronger than she had expected, and the water was shockingly cold. Halfway across, Anna stumbled and went under, her small hand slipping from Margaret's grasp. Without thinking, Margaret dove beneath the surface, her hands searching frantically in the murky water until she found the girl's arm and pulled her back up, coughing and gasping. Anna wrapped her arms around Margaret's neck with a grip that threatened to drag them both under. "It's all right," Margaret gasped, treading water while supporting both children. "I've got you. We're almost there." The passage she had spotted did indeed lead toward the main river. though it required them to swim through a completely submerged section before emerging into another air-filled chamber. Margaret made the crossing twice, first taking Anna, then returning for Joseph, who had waited with remarkable courage on a small outcropping of rock. The final chamber opened directly onto the Brazos River through a hidden opening concealed by overhanging vegetation. Margaret had passed this spot hundreds of times without ever realizing it connected to the cave system. She helped both children out of the water and onto the muddy bank, where they collapsed, shivering and exhausted. Margaret built a small fire using dry wood from the riverbank and techniques her father had taught her years earlier. As the flames took hold and began to throw warmth and light around their small camp, she got her first clear look at the children she had rescued. They were definitely twins, with the same high cheekbones and dark eyes, the same serious expression that seemed far too mature for their apparent age. Their clothes, now that she could see them clearly, told a story of two different worlds. Joseph's buckskin outfit was decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns that Margaret recognized as Native American, while Anna's dress was clearly of European origin, though much simpler than anything worn by the women of Cedar Ridge. "Where did you come from?" Margaret asked gently, as she helped them warm themselves by the fire. Again that exchange of glances between the twins before Joseph answered. "We lived with the mission people," he said carefully, "Father Martinez and the other teachers, but there was trouble and we had to run away." Margaret knew of several missions in the area, places where missionaries attempted to convert and educate Native American children. The work was dangerous and often unsuccessful, with many missions failing after attacks or simply being abandoned when the situation became too dangerous. "How did you end up in the caves?" she asked. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "We were hiding," Anna said, speaking for the first time since Margaret had pulled her from the water. Her English was better than her brother's, with less of an accent. "Men came to the mission, bad men with guns. Father Martinez told us to run and hide, so we ran to the river. But the water was high, and we fell in, and the current took us into the cave." Margaret nodded, understanding now how they had become trapped. The spring floods had raised the river level, and the current had carried them into the cave system through the same opening they had just used to escape. They had been lucky to find that ledge to climb onto, and even luckier that she had heard their cries for help. As the fire warmed them and their clothes began to dry, Margaret found herself studying the twins more carefully. There was something about them that didn't quite fit the story they were telling. Their clothes, their speech patterns, even the way they carried themselves suggested a more complex background than simply being mission children. Joseph caught her looking and met her gaze directly. For a moment, she saw something in his eyes that reminded her of the Comanche warriors she had encountered during trading expeditions with her father, a kind of fierce pride that no amount of mission education could completely erase. "We should go to the settlement," Margaret said finally. "Cedar Ridge isn't far from here. There are people there who can help you find your family or get word to the mission about what happened." Both children tensed at her words, and Anna moved closer. To her brother, Joseph shook his head firmly. "No settlement," he said. "Not safe for us there." "Why not?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Joseph looked at Anna, then back at Margaret. When he spoke again, his careful English slipped slightly, revealing the accent that marked him as someone for whom this was not his native language. "White settlements are not safe for Comanche children," he said quietly. The truth hung in the air between them, like smoke from their fire. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. These weren't mission children who had been caught up in some raid or conflict. These were Comanche twins, probably captured or traded to the mission as young children, and raised there until whatever disaster had sent them fleeing back toward their original people. Margaret's mind raced as she considered the implications. If these children were discovered in Cedar Ridge, they would likely be treated as potential threats, or at best, as curiosities to be studied and confined. The settlers had little patience for distinguishing between friendly and hostile Native Americans, especially children who might grow up to become warriors. But if she helped them return to their own people, she would be aiding what most of her neighbors would consider the enemy. The Comanche had raided settlements throughout this region, taken captives, killed settlers and soldiers alike. Helping these children could be seen as treason against her own people. Yet as she looked at Joseph and Anna, huddled together by the fire with their large dark eyes reflecting the flames, she saw only two frightened children who had nearly died in a flooded cave. Whatever their heritage, whatever the conflicts between their people and hers, they were just children who needed help. "Where were you trying to go when you got trapped in the cave?" she asked. Joseph pointed toward the north, across the river, and into the hills beyond. "Our father's people have a camp in the high country, 3 days' walk, maybe 4. We were trying to reach them when the water caught us." Margaret knew the area he was describing. It was rough country, full of canyons and mesas that provided perfect hiding places for a Comanche band. It was also extremely dangerous for anyone traveling alone, especially children. "You can't make that journey by yourselves," she said. "It's too far, and there are too many dangers. We have no choice," Anna said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If we stay, we will be killed or taken back to the mission. Our father told us that if we ever escaped, we should come to him." Margaret stared into the fire, her mind working through possibilities and consequences. These children had been living in two worlds, caught between the Comanche culture of their birth and the European culture of their education. Now they were trying to return to the first, but they needed help to make that journey safely. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to take them to Cedar Ridge and let others deal with the situation. But Margaret had seen too much frontier justice to believe that would end well for Joseph and Anna. More likely they would be confined, questioned, possibly separated, and eventually used as bargaining chips in whatever negotiations might take place between the settlement and local Comanche bands. As she sat by the fire, watching the flames dance while the twins huddled together in exhausted sleep, Margaret made a decision that would change all their lives forever. Margaret woke before dawn to find both children already awake, sitting motionless beside the dying embers of their fire. They had that quality she had noticed in wild animals, the ability to become completely still, almost invisible, when danger might be near. In the grey pre-dawn light, she could see them more clearly than she had the night before. Joseph had scars on his hands that spoke of hard work and possibly harder treatment. Anna's dress, despite being European in style, had been altered with shell buttons and bone ornaments that definitely weren't from any settlement store. These children had indeed lived in multiple worlds, adapting to survive in each. "Did you sleep at all?" Margaret asked softly. Anna shook her head. "We listened. There are riders coming from the south." Margaret's blood chilled. She strained her ears but heard nothing except the normal sounds of the river and awakening birds. But she had learned to trust the senses of people who had grown up having to stay alive in dangerous territory. "How many?" she whispered. Joseph held up 4 fingers, then added 2 more. 6 men, still far, but coming this way. They follow the river trail. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. 6 riders could be a patrol from Cedar Ridge, searching for signs of Indian activity, or they could be bounty hunters looking for escaped mission children. Worst of all, they might be raiders from one of the hostile bands that had been striking settlements throughout the region. "We need to move," she said, quickly scattering the ashes of their fire and gathering her few supplies. "Can you travel?" Both children nodded, though Margaret could see exhaustion in their faces. They had been through an ordeal that would have broken most adults, yet they were prepared to keep moving because stopping meant capture or death. Margaret led them away from the riverbank, following a game trail that wound through thick stands of oak and mesquite. The terrain here was broken and difficult, full of ravines and rocky outcroppings that provided cover but made travel slow and treacherous. She had hunted in this area with her father and knew it well enough to find routes that would be hard for mounted men to follow. They had been traveling for perhaps an hour when they heard the sound of horses behind them. The riders had reached their campsite and were searching the area. Margaret could hear men calling to each other, their voices carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Found tracks leading away from the river," one voice shouted. "Looks like 2, maybe 3 people on foot. Check for horse sign," another voice replied. "Could be Indians trying to steal livestock from the settlement." Margaret pressed the children behind a large boulder and peered back through the trees. She could see 6 men on horseback, all armed with rifles and clearly experienced at tracking. Their leader was a tall man with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of hard living on the frontier. She recognized him, Captain Wade Morrison, a former army officer who now led a company of rangers tasked with protecting the settlements from Indian raids. Morrison was known for his effectiveness and his ruthlessness. He made no distinction between hostile warriors and peaceful Indians, believing that the only solution to the frontier conflict was the complete removal of all Native Americans from Texas. If Morrison found the twins, their fate would be sealed. They would be taken back to Cedar Ridge, questioned harshly, and likely used as leverage in negotiations with local bands. At best, they would spend their lives as prisoners in a world that would never accept them. At worst, they might not survive the questioning. "Captain," one of Morrison's men called out, "these tracks are fresh. Made this morning, I'd say." Morrison spurred his horse closer to examine the trail Margaret and the children had left. Even from her hiding place, she could see his expression harden as he studied the signs. 2 children, he said finally. Small feet, light step, and 1 adult, probably a woman. He looked up, scanning the tree line where Margaret and the twins were hidden. The mission at San Luis was attacked 3 days ago. 2 children escaped in the confusion, half-breed twins who had been there for years. Margaret's heart sank. Morrison knew exactly who he was hunting and why. This wasn't a random patrol. It was a deliberate search for Joseph and Anna. "There's a reward for bringing them back alive," Morrison continued. $50 each, to be paid by the territorial authority. They want to question these children about Comanche movements and plans. $50 was more money than most settlers saw in a year. Margaret understood now why Morrison was being so thorough in his search. This wasn't just about frontier security, it was about profit. "Spread out," Morrison ordered his men. He can't have gone far on foot. Check every ravine, every hiding place, and remember, we want them alive if possible, but dead is better than escaping." Margaret waited until the searchers had moved away from their position, then led the twins deeper into the broken country. They traveled in single file, with Margaret carefully choosing routes that would leave minimal tracks while still allowing them to make progress toward the north. The children followed without complaint, though she could see they were struggling with exhaustion and hunger. They had eaten nothing since their rescue, except some wild berries Margaret had found along the trail. She knew they needed food and rest, but stopping now would mean capture. Around midday, they reached a narrow canyon that cut deep into the limestone bedrock. Margaret remembered this place from hunting trips with her father. A hidden valley with a spring and enough game to sustain them for a few days if necessary. More importantly, it had only one entrance, which made it easier to defend, but also turned it into a trap if they were discovered. "We'll rest here," she told the children as they descended into the canyon. "There's water and I might be able to catch some fish or find other food." The spring bubbled up from underground, creating a small pool surrounded by cottonwood trees and thick grass. It was a beautiful, peaceful place that seemed untouched by the violence and conflict that marked so much of the frontier. Joseph and Anna drank deeply from the clear water, then collapsed in the shade, finally allowing themselves to show how exhausted they truly were. Margaret used the time to fashion a simple fishing line from threads pulled from her shirt and a hook bent from a metal button. The pool contained several large trout, and she managed to catch enough for a meal. She built a small, smokeless fire using dry wood and techniques her father had taught her, then cooked the fish wrapped in green leaves to contain the smell. As they ate, she encouraged the children to tell her more about their background. The story that emerged was both tragic and complex. Joseph and Anna had been born to a Comanche war chief named Running Bear and his wife White Dove in 1838. When they were 4 years old, their mother had died in a cholera epidemic that swept through the band. Running Bear, devastated by grief and believing that contact with white settlers had brought the disease to his people, had become increasingly hostile toward all Europeans. During a particularly brutal raid on a wagon train, the twins had been seriously injured when a burning wagon collapsed near where they were playing. Running Bear, believing they were dying and perhaps influenced by his wife's Christian beliefs, she had been captured as a child and raised by missionaries before escaping back to her people, had given the children to Father Martinez at the San Luis Mission, asking the priest to save their lives and souls. For 5 years, Joseph and Anna had lived at the mission, learning English, mathematics, Christian doctrine, and European customs. But they had never forgotten their Comanche heritage, speaking their native language in secret and maintaining the cultural practices their parents had taught them. The attack on the mission had come without warning. A group of raiders, not Comanche, but Kiowa warriors seeking captives and supplies, had struck at dawn. Father Martinez and most of the other adults had been killed and the buildings had been burned. In the confusion, Joseph and Anna had escaped into the countryside, hoping to find their way back to their father's people. "We heard Father Martinez talking to the soldiers," Anna explained as they finished their meal. "He said our father had become a great war chief, that his band was one of the strongest in all the Comanche nation. We thought if we could find him, we would be safe." Margaret listened to their story with growing concern. Running Bear was indeed a name she had heard before, usually spoken with fear and hatred by the settlers of Cedar Ridge. He was reportedly one of the most effective and ruthless of the Comanche war leaders, responsible for numerous raids on settlements throughout the region. If these children were his offspring, their value as hostages or sources of information would be enormous. But it also meant that their father would stop at nothing to get them back once he learned they were alive and free. "How were you planning to find your father's band?" Margaret asked. Joseph pointed toward the north, beyond the canyon walls. "Father Martinez showed us maps. He said our people move with the seasons, but there are sacred places where they return each year. There is a place called Eagle's Rest in the high mesas 3 days from here. If we can reach it, we can find someone who knows where our father has taken the band." Margaret knew Eagle's Rest by reputation, a series of high mesas and hidden valleys that provided perfect defensive positions and access to water and game. It was also deep in territory that was effectively controlled by hostile Comanche bands. A white woman traveling alone in that country would be signing her own death warrant. But as she looked at Joseph and Anna, she realized she had already made her choice. These children had been through enough trauma and loss. She couldn't abandon them now, even if it meant risking everything she had built in Cedar Ridge. "It's too dangerous for you to travel alone," she said finally. "If you're determined to find your father, I'll help you get there." Both children stared at her in surprise. Anna's eyes filled with tears, while Joseph's expression became even more serious than usual. "You would do this?" he asked. "Even though we are Comanche, even though our father has fought against your people?" Margaret thought about her comfortable life in Cedar Ridge, her father's farm, the future she had planned for herself as a settler's daughter. Then she looked at these two children who had already lost so much and faced losing everything else. "You're not warriors," she said simply. "You're children who need help, that's all that matters." That afternoon, while the twins rested in the shade, Margaret began planning their journey. She would need supplies, weapons, and a way to travel through hostile territory without being detected by either Morrison's Rangers or the various Indian bands that controlled the region. She had one advantage: her years of hunting and exploring. With her father had given her knowledge of routes and hiding places that few other settlers possessed. She also understood the rhythms of frontier life well enough to predict where dangers might be greatest and when travel would be safest. But she would be traveling with two children through a country where discovery meant death, pursued by professional trackers who had both financial incentives and official authority to capture or kill them. The odds against success were overwhelming. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold, Margaret made her final preparations. She would leave at dawn, taking Joseph and Anna north toward Eagle's Rest and whatever fate awaited them there. She had no way of knowing that at that very moment, a Comanche war party led by a fierce chief with scars across his face was riding hard toward the same region, following reports that two children matching the description of Running Bear's lost twins had been seen near the Brazos River. The collision of these forces, Margaret's desperate rescue mission, Morrison's determined pursuit, and Running Bear's search for his children would create a confrontation that would echo through the history of the Texas frontier for generations to come. The second day of their journey northward brought challenges Margaret hadn't anticipated. Joseph developed a fever during the night, his body finally succumbing to the ordeal of nearly drowning in the cave and the stress of constant flight. By morning, he could barely stand, let alone walk the difficult terrain that lay ahead. Anna knelt beside her brother, speaking to him in rapid Comanche while pressing her small hand against his burning forehead. Margaret had no medical supplies, beyond basic frontier remedies, and they were still at least 2 days from Eagle's Rest under the best conditions. "There's a trading post about 6 miles east of here," Margaret said, studying Joseph's flushed face and labored breathing. "A man named Dutch Henry runs it. He trades with both settlers and Indians, asks no questions. I might be able to get medicine there." Anna looked up sharply. "It's too dangerous. Captain Morrison's men will be watching all the trading posts." Margaret knew Anna was right, but they had few options. Joseph needed help that she couldn't provide with forest remedies alone. "I'll go alone," she decided. "You stay hidden with your brother. If I'm not back by sunset, take him and head north. Follow the creek bed. It will lead you toward the high country." "No," Anna said firmly, displaying a stubborn streak that reminded Margaret of her own determination. "We stay together. That's what kept us alive at the mission when the bad men came." Margaret studied the girl's face, seeing a maturity born of survival and loss. Anna had already learned lessons about loyalty and trust that many adults never mastered. But she had also learned to be suspicious of separation, probably from bitter experience. "Then we all go," Margaret said finally. "But we approach carefully, and at the first sign of trouble, we disappear into the woods." They traveled slowly, with Margaret supporting Joseph when the fever made him stumble. The trading post sat in a clearing beside a creek, a low building constructed of logs and adobe with a corral containing several horses. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Margaret could see movement inside through the single window. She had the twins wait in a thicket of oak trees while she approached alone, watching for any sign that Morrison's Rangers might be using the post as a base for their search. The horses in the corral were unfamiliar to her, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. Dutch Henry's customers came from all over the territory. The door opened before she could knock, and Dutch Henry himself stepped out, a massive man with graying red hair and arms like tree trunks. He had been a mountain man before settling down to trade, and still carried himself like someone comfortable with violence. "Margaret Henderson," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent from his Pennsylvania Dutch heritage. "Your father's been looking for you. Seems you didn't come home yesterday evening." Margaret's heart sank. If her father had contacted Dutch Henry, he had probably also spoken with others, possibly including Morrison. Is he here? No, but he was. Left about 2 hours ago, heading back towards Cedar Ridge. Said to tell you to get yourself home before he comes looking with a horsewhip. Dutch Henry's eyes were shrewd as he studied her face. "You look like you've been sleeping rough, and you're not alone, are you?" There was no point in lying to a man who had survived decades on the frontier by reading people and situations accurately. "I need medicine," Margaret said simply. "Fever and chills. Someone who's been through a hard time." Dutch Henry nodded slowly. "Someone young, I'd guess. And probably someone who shouldn't be seen around these parts." He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter the trading post. "Come inside. We'll talk." The interior of the post was cramped and cluttered, filled with everything from ammunition to cooking pots to bolts of cloth. Dutch Henry moved to a shelf behind his counter and selected a small bottle filled with dark liquid. "Willow bark extract," he explained. "Good for fever and pain. Give a few drops in water every few hours." He paused, then selected another bottle. "This is quinine. Harder to come by, but better for serious fever. Use it sparingly." Margaret reached for her small purse, but Dutch Henry waved her money away. "Consider it a favor to your father. Samuel Henderson is a good man." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But you should know that Captain Morrison was here this morning. He's looking for someone, 2 children who escaped from the San Luis mission. Half-breed twins," he said. "There's a substantial reward." "What did you tell him?" "That I hadn't seen anyone matching that description," which was true at the time. Dutch Henry's eyes were serious now. "But Margaret, if you're mixed up in something like this, you need to be very careful. Morrison isn't just after those children. For the reward. There are political considerations." Margaret frowned. "What kind of political considerations?" "The territorial authority is under pressure from Washington to negotiate some kind of peace with the Comanche bands. They think having Chief Running Bear's children as, let's call them guests, would give them significant leverage in those negotiations." The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. If the government wanted to use Joseph and Anna as political pawns, they would never be allowed to return to their father. They would spend their lives as prisoners, symbols of white authority over the Comanche people. "There's more," Dutch Henry continued. "Word is that Running Bear himself is looking for those children. He's got war parties combing the countryside, and they're not being gentle about it. 3 homesteads burned in the last week, and every white person they find gets questioned about 2 missing children." Margaret felt the walls closing in around them. Morrison's rangers from the south, government agents wanting to use the twins as political tools, and Comanche war parties from the north, all converging on the same small area of Texas frontier. "Dutch," she said carefully, "if someone were traveling north from here, trying to avoid both white patrols and Indian war parties, what would be the safest route?" The big man studied her for a long moment. "There is no safe route, Margaret. The whole territory is stirred up like a hornet's nest. But if someone absolutely had to travel north..." He moved to a rough map tacked to the wall behind his counter. "Here's the Brazos, and here's where we are now. The most direct route would be up through Devil's Canyon and across the Llano Estacado, but that's where most of the Comanche activity is concentrated." He traced an alternative route with his finger. "A longer way would be to follow Willow Creek west, then north through the Badlands. Harder travel, but less likely to encounter organized parties from either side. There's an old Spanish mission ruins about here, San Miguel, abandoned for decades but with a good well. From there, it's a hard day's ride to the high mesas. Margaret memorized the route, understanding that their lives might depend on following it exactly. How long would that journey take on foot? 4 days, maybe 5, depending on conditions. And how fast you can travel. Dutch Henry's expression was grave. But Margaret, I have to ask, are you sure you want to do this? Whatever you're mixed up in, it's not going to end well for anyone involved. Before Margaret could answer, the sound of approaching horses made both of them freeze. Dutch Henry moved quickly to the window, peering out through the grimy glass. 3 riders, he said quietly, not Morrison's men. These look like they might be Comanche scouts. Margaret's blood turned to ice. If Comanche warriors found the twins here, the results could be catastrophic. They might not believe that Joseph and Anna were Running Bear's children, or they might decide to take them by force, possibly killing Margaret in the process. "Back door," she whispered. Dutch Henry nodded toward a door, partially hidden behind stacks of trade goods. "Leads to the creek, but you'll have to move fast." Margaret slipped through the rear door and ran toward the thicket where she had left. The twins. Anna saw her coming and immediately began helping her brother to his feet, understanding without words that danger was approaching. They moved as quickly as Joseph's condition allowed, following the creek bed away from the trading post. Behind them, Margaret could hear voices, Dutch Henry greeting the newcomers in a mixture of English and what sounded like Spanish and Comanche words. Trade, children, white woman. The words drifted across the water, and Margaret realized the warriors were asking about them specifically. Dutch Henry's responses were too quiet to understand, but his tone suggested he was being helpful while revealing nothing useful. They traveled for an hour through difficult terrain, with Joseph leaning heavily on both Margaret and his sister. The medicine from Dutch Henry seemed to be helping. His fever had broken, and his breathing was easier, but he was still weak from their ordeal. When they finally stopped to rest in a grove of cottonwoods, Margaret gave Joseph another dose of the willow bark extract and assessed their situation. They were now committed to the longer, more difficult route that Dutch Henry had described. The direct path to Eagle's Rest was blocked by Comanche war parties, while the southern routes were controlled by Morrison's rangers. "How much farther?" Anna asked, bathing her brother's face with cool water from the creek. 4 days, maybe 5, Margaret replied honestly. "But we'll be traveling through a country where we can't light fires or make noise. It's going to be hard." Joseph stirred, his eyes clearer than they had been all day. "Our father," he said quietly. "He's looking for us, isn't he?" Margaret nodded. "Dutch Henry says there are war parties searching everywhere. Your father knows. You're alive. He'll be angry," Anna said, her voice small. "We were supposed to stay at the mission and be safe. He gave us to Father Martinez to protect us from the wars." "Your father will understand," Margaret said, though she wasn't certain of that at all. Parents do what they think is best for their children, but sometimes children have to make their own choices. That night, they made camp in a shallow cave that provided shelter without requiring a fire. Margaret rationed out the last of their food, some jerky and hardtack she had brought from her original supply run, supplemented by wild onions and berries Anna had found along their path. As the twins slept, Margaret kept watch, listening to the sounds of the night and trying to plan their next moves. They were now deeper in disputed territory than she had ever traveled, following game trails and creek beds that appeared on no settler's map. She thought about her father, probably sick with worry about her disappearance. Samuel Henderson was a tough man, but he loved his daughter fiercely, and her absence would be tearing him apart. She wondered if he would understand her choice to help Joseph and Anna, or if he would see it as a betrayal of everything he had worked to build in Cedar Ridge. Around midnight, she heard something that made her blood run cold, the distant sound of drums carrying across the hills from somewhere to the north. It was a sound she had heard before, during Comanche raids, a BE, rhythm that spoke of war councils and preparations for battle. The drums continued for hours, joined eventually by others from different directions. Margaret realized she was listening to communication between multiple war parties, coordinating their movements across a vast area. The entire Northern Territory was mobilizing, and they were walking directly into the center of it. But there was no turning back now. Joseph and Anna were depending on her, and she had given her word. Whatever lay ahead at Eagle's Rest, they would face it together. The ruins of San Miguel Mission appeared through the morning haze like the skeleton of some ancient beast. Margaret had expected crumbling adobe walls and perhaps the remains of a chapel, but what she found was far more extensive. An entire complex of buildings, workshops, and defensive walls that spoke of a once thriving community. Joseph had recovered enough strength to walk on his own, though Margaret could see the effort it cost him. Anna had barely spoken since hearing the war drums the previous night, her young face etched with worry that went beyond their immediate dangers. "How long has this place been empty?" Margaret asked as they approached the main gate. "It's heavy. Wooden doors hanging askew on rusted iron hinges." "Father Martinez told us stories," Anna replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "San Miguel was destroyed in 1836, during the big war between Texas and Mexico. The priests and most of the people fled south, but some stayed to defend it. They all died. The evidence of that final battle was still visible as they entered the compound. Scorch marks blackened the walls where fires had raged, and Margaret could see places where cannonballs had smashed through the thick adobe. But nature had begun to reclaim the ruins. Vines grew through shattered windows, and small trees had taken root in what had once been the central courtyard. The well that Dutch Henry had mentioned stood in the center of the compound. Its stone, walls intact, and the water clear and cold when Margaret lowered a bucket she found nearby. They drank deeply and refilled their water containers, the first time they had been able to drink their fill since leaving the canyon. "We should rest here during the day," Margaret decided. "Travel at night when it's harder for anyone to spot us." They found shelter in what had been the mission's library, its walls still standing, though the roof had partially collapsed. Enough remained to provide protection from sun and wind, and the stone floor was dry, despite years of abandonment. As the twins rested, Margaret explored the ruins, trying to understand what had happened here and what it might tell her about the country they were entering. The mission had been more than just a religious outpost. It had been a fortress designed to protect both Spanish colonists and converted Indians from the hostile tribes that controlled the surrounding territory. In what had been the chapel, she found something that made her pause. Carved into the stone altar were names and dates, scratched there by people who had known they were going to die. Some were Spanish, others appeared to be Indian names written in European letters. The final date was April 15th, 1836. 11 years ago, but it was what she found in the ruins of the priest's quarters that truly shocked her. Hidden beneath a fallen beam, protected by oiled leather, was a journal written in Spanish. Margaret's Spanish was limited, but she could make out enough to understand that this was a record of the mission's final days. The priest who had written it, Father Sebastian, described increasingly desperate attempts to negotiate peace with the Comanche bands that were pressing closer to the mission. He wrote of children caught between two worlds, of parents who brought their offspring to be educated in European ways while still hoping they would remember their tribal heritage. One entry, dated just days before the mission's destruction, caught Margaret's attention. The war chief Running Bear came again today, seeking news of his children. "He believes they died in the sickness, but I could not tell him the truth, that they live still among the white settlements. The knowledge would destroy him, as it has destroyed so many others who have lost children to this endless war between our peoples." Margaret's hands trembled as she read. Father Martinez at San Luis hadn't been the first priest to know Joseph and Anna's true parentage. The children had been moved between missions, hidden from their father for years, while various religious authorities debated what to do with them. She brought the journal back to where the twins were resting and carefully explained what she had discovered. Both children listened in stunned silence as she translated the relevant passages. "Father Sebastian knew who we were," Joseph said finally. "All those years at San Luis, we thought Father Martinez was the only one who knew our real names." "They were protecting you," Margaret said, though she wondered if that was entirely true. "Keeping you safe from the wars." Anna's expression was bitter beyond her years. "Safe? We were prisoners. They took us from our father and never told him we were alive. Do you know what that means for a Comanche parent, to believe your children are dead when they're not?" Margaret was beginning to understand the true scope of the tragedy she had become involved in. This wasn't just about two lost children. It was about a father who had spent years believing his offspring were dead, becoming increasingly hostile and violent as his grief consumed him. If the stories were true, Running Bear's raids on white settlements had intensified dramatically after he believed he had lost Joseph and Anna. They slept fitfully during the day, taking turns keeping watch from the mission's bell tower, which still provided a commanding view of the surrounding country. Margaret could see smoke from distant fires, whether campfires or burned homesteads, she couldn't tell. The land looked empty from their vantage point, but she knew that was deceptive. Armies could move across this terrain without being seen, until they were almost on top of you. As evening approached, they prepared to leave San Miguel and begin the final push toward Eagle's Rest. According to Dutch Henry's directions, they had one more day of hard travel through increasingly difficult terrain before reaching the mesa country where Running Bear's band was supposed to be camped. They left the mission as the sun set, following a barely visible trail that wound through broken country filled with arroyos and rocky outcroppings. The night was clear and cold, with enough starlight to see their path without making them too visible to distant watchers. They had been traveling for perhaps 3 hours when Anna suddenly stopped, her head tilted as if listening to something. Margaret couldn't hear. "What is it?" Margaret whispered. "Horses," Anna replied. "Many horses moving fast, coming from the east." Margaret strained her ears and finally caught the sound, the thunder of hoofbeats carried on the night wind. A large group of riders was approaching their position, still distant but closing fast. "Morrison's Rangers?" Joseph asked. Margaret shook her head. "Too many horses, and they're not following any trail. They're moving cross-country like they know exactly where they're going." The realization hit all three of them simultaneously. This wasn't a patrol or a search party. This was a war party, and they were moving with the purposeful speed of warriors who had received specific information about their target. "They know where we are," Anna said, her voice tight with fear. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. How could a Comanche war party know their exact location? They had been careful to avoid detection, staying off main trails and traveling at night. "Unless—" "The trading post," she said suddenly. "Dutch Henry said he hadn't seen anyone matching your description when Morrison asked, but he didn't say anything about Comanche warriors." The implications were terrifying. If Dutch Henry had given information to the war party, either willingly or under duress, then they weren't just being pursued. They were being herded toward a specific location where Running Bear's warriors would be waiting. The sound of hoofbeats was getting closer, and now Margaret could hear something else. War cries echoing across the hills, the kind of sounds that had terrorized frontier settlements for decades. "There." Joseph pointed toward a cluster of boulders, about a quarter-mile ahead. "We can hide there until they pass." They ran through the darkness, stumbling over rocks and thorny brush, the sound of pursuing horses growing louder behind them. Margaret realized with growing horror that the warriors weren't just following their trail. They were driving them, like hunters herding game toward waiting nets. They reached the boulders just as the first riders appeared on the ridge behind them. In the starlight, Margaret could see the silhouettes of mounted warriors, at least 20 of them, spread out in a line that stretched across the entire valley. But it was what she saw ahead that made her blood freeze. More riders were emerging from concealment among the rocks and trees that surrounded their hiding place. They had run directly into a trap, with Comanche warriors positioned on 3 sides and only one route of escape, straight north toward Eagle's Rest, and whatever awaited them there. "They're not trying to capture us," Anna whispered, her voice filled with sudden understanding. "They're driving us home." Margaret understood then what was happening. Running Bear hadn't sent war parties to randomly search for his children. He had orchestrated an elaborate strategy to force them toward him, using information from multiple sources to predict their movements and guide them to where he wanted them to go. The war cries grew louder, and Margaret could see torches being lit. Among the surrounding rocks, the warriors were announcing their presence, making sure that Margaret and the twins knew they were trapped and had only one direction to run. "What do we do?" Joseph asked, looking to Margaret for guidance, even though they were approaching his father's territory. Margaret studied the positions of the warriors, calculating distances and possibilities. They could surrender here and hope that Running Bear's men would recognize the twins and treat them gently. They could try to fight, though 3 people against 20 mounted warriors would be suicidal, or they could do what the Comanche wanted in them to do, run north toward Eagle's Rest and whatever confrontation awaited them there. "We run," she said finally, "but we run on our terms, not theirs." Instead of taking the obvious path north, Margaret led them west toward a steep-sided arroyo she had spotted earlier. The warriors would expect them to head straight for Eagle's Rest, but the arroyo led to a series of hidden canyons that might provide alternative routes to the mesa country. They slid down the rocky sides of the arroyo as the war cries intensified behind them. Margaret could hear horses being spurred to pursuit, but the narrow confines of the canyon would make mounted pursuit difficult. The arroyo twisted and branched, creating a maze of possible routes. Margaret chose paths that seemed to lead generally northward, while making their trail as difficult to follow as possible. Behind them, she could hear the warriors calling to each other, coordinating their search of the various canyon branches. They emerged from the canyon system as dawn was breaking, finding themselves on a high plateau that overlooked the mesa country ahead. Eagle's Rest was visible in the distance, a series of flat-topped mountains that rose like ancient fortresses from the surrounding plains. But between them and their destination lay something that made Margaret's heart sink. Spread across the valley floor below them were dozens of lodges, hundreds of horses, and what appeared to be the largest gathering of Comanche warriors she had ever seen or heard described. Running Bear hadn't just sent search parties to find his children. He had assembled his entire band, along with allies from other groups, creating a force that could challenge any army the Texas settlers might send against them. And at the center of the vast encampment, on a small rise that commanded the entire valley, stood a single lodge larger and more elaborate than all the others. Even at this distance, Margaret could see the figure of a man standing before it, motionless as a statue, looking directly toward the plateau where they stood. Running Bear had been waiting for them. Running Bear was not what Margaret had expected. They descended into the valley under escort of 6 mounted warriors. She had imagined meeting the savage war chief of settler nightmares, painted for battle, adorned with scalps, radiating the kind of primitive ferocity that frontier stories always described. Instead, the man who stood waiting for them was tall and lean, with graying hair braided with silver ornaments, and wearing simple buckskin decorated only with geometric patterns in blue and white beadwork. His face bore the scars of old battles, but his eyes held something Margaret hadn't anticipated: profound exhaustion mixed with desperate hope. This was not the face of a man drunk on violence, but of a father who had believed his children were dead and was now confronting the possibility that he had been wrong. Joseph and Anna walked slightly ahead of Margaret, their steps growing slower. As they approached the man they barely remembered, 5 years at the mission had changed them both, but their father had changed too. The young war chief who had given his dying children to the missionaries had become something harder and more dangerous. The entire encampment had fallen silent as they crossed the valley floor. Hundreds of people, warriors, women, children, elders, stood in perfect stillness, watching this reunion that would determine not just the fate of 3 individuals, but possibly the future of the entire region. Running Bear spoke first, his voice carrying clearly in the silent air. The words were in Comanche, flowing and musical, but Margaret could hear the pain beneath them. Anna responded hesitantly, her childhood language rusty from years of disuse. Joseph said nothing, his young face torn between recognition and uncertainty. Then Running Bear switched to English, his accent thick, but his words carefully chosen. "My children, you have grown tall in the white man's world." "Father," Anna whispered, the single word seeming to break something inside the war chief. His composed expression cracked, revealing the raw grief he had carried for 5 years, but when his gaze turned to Margaret, his face hardened again. "And you are the white woman who brought them home. Why?" Margaret had rehearsed this moment during their long journey, trying to find words that would explain her actions without provoking the violence that seemed to hover just beneath the surface of everything happening here. But standing before Running Bear, surrounded by hundreds of his warriors, all her prepared speeches seemed inadequate. "Because they're children," she said simply, "and they needed help." Running Bear studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to look straight through her. "Children," he repeated slowly. "Yes, my children, whom the priest told me had died of the white man's sickness. My children for whom I have mourned and raged for 5 years. My children whose death turned my heart to stone and my hand to war." The implications of his words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She began to understand the true scope of what the missionaries' deception had cost. Running Bear's increasing hostility, his raids on settlements, the violence that had made his name feared throughout Texas. All of it had been driven by grief over children who weren't actually dead. "You did not know," Anna said quietly, speaking to her father in English so Margaret could understand. "The priests told you we died, but they took us to another mission. They said it was to keep us safe from the wars." "Safe," Running Bear repeated, and Margaret heard bitter laughter in his voice. "Safe from their father, safe from their people, safe from everything that would remind them who they truly were." He looked at his children again, taking in their European clothes, their careful English, the way they stood uncertainly between 2 worlds. "Do you remember your names?" he asked them. "Your real names, given to you by your mother before she went to join the spirits?" Joseph and Anna exchanged glances, and Margaret saw them struggle with memories that had been buried beneath. Years of missionary education. "Swift water," Anna said finally, the Comanche words sounding strange in her mouth. "My name was Swiftwater." "Dancing horse," Joseph added, his voice barely audible. "I was called Dancing Horse." Running Bear nodded slowly, and Margaret saw tears he was trying to hide. "Your mother chose those names because you were born during the spring floods, when the rivers ran fast and the horses were restless with new grass. She said you would both be quick like water and free like horses running across the plains." Margaret felt like an intruder witnessing this reunion, but she understood that her presence was crucial. She was the bridge between worlds, the one person who could speak for both sides in what was essentially a negotiation between 2 cultures that had been at war for decades. "The children wanted to come home," she said. "When the mission was attacked and they escaped, they could have come to our settlement. Instead, they chose to find their way back to you." Running Bear's attention turned back to her, and she saw him reassessing her role in events. "Yet you helped them. Why would a white woman risk her life to return Comanche children to their father?" Margaret thought about all the easy answers she could give, about duty, about conscience, about simple human decency. But standing here, surrounded by the full weight of consequences her actions had set in motion, she found herself speaking a deeper truth. "Because I've seen what happens when children are torn between worlds," she said. "My grandmother was Cherokee, taken from her people when she was young and raised by white families. She spent her whole life caught between two identities, never fully belonging to either. I didn't want that for Joseph and Anna." The revelation clearly surprised Running Bear. "You have Indian blood?" "1/4, Margaret admitted. "Enough that some people in the settlements question my loyalty. Not enough that I was ever accepted by any tribe." Running Bear considered this information, and Margaret could see him recalculating everything he thought he knew about her motivations. A white woman helping Indian children was one thing, an act of misguided charity perhaps, or simple soft-heartedness. But a woman with native ancestry making a conscious choice to bridge two worlds was something entirely different. "So you understand," he said finally, "what it means to be caught between peoples." "I understand," Margaret confirmed, "and I understand that these children have been through enough. Whatever happens next, they shouldn't be made to suffer for. Choices that adults made years ago." At that moment, a commotion arose from the edge of the encampment. Riders were approaching from the south, not Comanche warriors, but white men under a flag of truce. Margaret's heart sank as she recognized the lead rider, Captain Morrison, accompanied by 5 of his rangers and 2 men in civilian clothes who had the look of government officials. Running Bear saw them too, and his expression hardened into the mask of the war chief that settlers feared. Around the encampment, warriors began reaching for weapons, though they didn't yet move to attack. "Your people have come for you," Running Bear said to Margaret, his voice now cold and formal. "They're not my people," Margaret replied quickly. "I mean, they're from my settlement, but they're here because of the reward for the children. They want to take Joseph and Anna back to be used as political prisoners." Running Bear's eyes flashed with anger. "To use my children as weapons against me?" "The government wants to force peace negotiations," Margaret explained. "They think having your children as guests would give them leverage." The war chief's face became stone. "No one takes my children again. No one uses them as tools in the white man's political games." Morrison and his party rode into the center of the encampment with the kind of arrogant confidence that Margaret recognized as either supreme courage or complete stupidity. The captain dismounted and approached the group around Running Bear, his hand resting casually on his pistol butt. "Chief Running Bear," Morrison said, his voice carrying the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I am Captain Morrison of the Texas Rangers. I've come for the woman and the 2 children she kidnapped." "From lawful custody." "Kidnapped?" Running Bear repeated, his English suddenly becoming more precise and formal. "These are my children, Captain Morrison. They came to me of their own will, guided by a woman who showed them kindness when others would have made them prisoners." "The children are wards of the territorial authority," one of the government officials interjected, stepping forward with official papers. "They were in the protective custody of the San Luis mission when they were illegally removed. We have orders to return them to proper facilities where they can be cared for and educated." Margaret watched Running Bear's face as the official spoke, seeing the war chief struggle to control his rage. Around them, the tension in the encampment was becoming palpable. Warriors were moving closer, weapons were being quietly prepared, and women were beginning to move children toward the safety of the lodges. Protective custody, Running Bear said slowly. Like the protective custody that told me my children were dead while you used them for your own purposes. Morrison's hand tightened on his weapon. I don't know what lies you've been told, Chief, but these children have been well cared for. They've received education and Christian instruction that will serve them well in the modern world. The modern world, Running Bear repeated. You mean the world where my people are driven from their lands, where our children are stolen and our culture is destroyed in the name of civilization? Margaret realized the situation was spiraling toward violence with terrifying speed. Morrison and his men were outnumbered by hundreds to one, but their deaths would bring the full weight of the United States Army down on Running Bear's people, and Joseph and Anna would once again be caught in the middle of a war between adults who claimed to be protecting them. Wait, she said, stepping between the two groups. There has to be another way. Morrison turned his attention to her, his expression cold. Margaret Henderson, you are under arrest for kidnapping, aiding and abetting escaped prisoners, and treason against the territory of Texas. You will surrender yourself and the children immediately. The children don't want to go with you, Margaret said firmly. They want to be with their father. What they want is irrelevant, the government official replied. They are minors under the protection of the territorial government. Their wishes have no legal standing. Running Bear took a step forward, his hand moving to the tomahawk at his belt. In Comanche law, children belong to their parents, not to governments or priests or any other strangers who claim authority over them. We're not operating under Comanche law, Morrison said bluntly. This is American territory, subject to American law. American territory stolen from my people, Running Bear replied, his voice rising, built on American lies and American broken promises. Margaret could see the confrontation reaching the point of no return. In moments, violence would erupt that would destroy any chance of a peaceful resolution, and probably cost many lives, including possibly those of the children everyone claimed to be protecting. But as she looked at Joseph and Anna, standing between their father and the government officials who wanted to claim them, she saw something that gave her an idea. The twins were watching the adult confrontation with expressions that were neither purely Comanche nor purely European. They were something new, children who had experienced both worlds and could perhaps speak for both. Let them choose, Margaret said suddenly, her voice cutting through the rising tension. Everyone turned to look at her. What? Morrison demanded. Let Joseph and Anna choose for themselves, Margaret repeated. They're old enough to understand what's happening. They've lived in both worlds. Let them decide where they want to be. Running Bear frowned. They are children. This is not a decision for children to make. They're the only ones who should. Make it, Margaret insisted. Everyone else here has their own agenda, political, military, personal. But Joseph and Anna are the ones who will have to live with the consequences. They should have a voice in determining their own fate. The silence that followed Margaret's proposal stretched like a taut bowstring ready to snap. Joseph and Anna stood frozen between their father and the government officials, suddenly aware that the eyes of hundreds of people were fixed upon them, waiting for words that would determine not just their own fate, but possibly the future of peace between two peoples. Captain Morrison was the first to break the silence. Absolutely not. These children are not competent to make legal decisions about their custody. They're minors under territorial jurisdiction. They are my blood, Running Bear countered, his voice deadly quiet. No white man's law supersedes the bonds between Comanche father and child. But it was Anna who surprised everyone by stepping forward, her young voice cutting through the adult arguments with startling clarity. We have something to say, the government official waved dismissively. Child, you don't understand the complexities. We understand more than you think, Joseph interrupted, joining his sister. We have lived in your world for 5 years. We know your language, your customs, your laws. We also remember our birth people, our real names, our mother's songs. Anna's voice grew stronger as she continued. At the mission, they told us our father was a savage who would kill us if we ever returned to him. They said we were saved from a life of darkness and ignorance, but they also told our father we were dead, causing him years of grief that turned to anger. Margaret watched the faces around them as Anna spoke. The government officials looked impatient and dismissive. Morrison appeared increasingly agitated, but Running Bear's expression showed something she hadn't expected, pride mixed with sorrow, as he listened to his daughter speak with such eloquence. In the white man's language, both sides lied to us, Joseph said, his voice carrying a maturity far beyond his years. The missionaries lied about our father. Our father's people lied when they raided innocent settlements, claiming it was justice for wrongs done to them. Everyone used us as reasons for their anger without asking what we wanted. The twins looked at each other, and Margaret saw a silent communication pass between them, the kind of understanding that only comes from shared trauma and survival. We choose both, Anna said finally. And we choose neither. Morrison stepped forward aggressively. That's not an option. You can't let them speak, Running Bear commanded, and something in his tone made even the ranger captain pause. Joseph took his sister's hand before continuing. We have seen the white world try to destroy Indian culture through schools and missions. We have also seen Indian raids destroy white families who never harmed anyone. Both sides call it justice, but it's really just revenge that never ends. We are tired of being symbols, Anna added, tired of being trophies that prove one side is right and the other is wrong. We want to be children who can love both their father and the woman who saved them. Children who can speak Comanche and English, who can understand both worlds without having to reject either one. Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes as she listened to these young people articulate truths that the adults around them had been unable or unwilling to face. They had found wisdom in their suffering, understanding that the cycle of violence could only be broken by someone willing to step outside it entirely. What you're suggesting is impossible, the government official said impatiently. You must live somewhere, under some authority. You can't exist between jurisdictions. Running Bear looked at his children for a long moment, and Margaret could see him wrestling with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to claim them completely, to erase the years of separation and return them fully to Comanche life. But another part, the part that was a father rather than a war chief, was listening to what they actually needed. There is a way, he said slowly, the words seeming to surprise him as he spoke them, an old way from the time before the wars became so bitter. He turned to address not just Margaret and the officials, but the entire gathering of his people. When he spoke, it was in Comanche, his voice carrying the formal cadences of ceremonial speech. Margaret couldn't understand the words, but she could hear their weight and importance in the responding murmurs from the crowd. I invoke the right of adoption, Running Bear said, switching back to English. In the old days, when captives were taken from other tribes, they could become full members of our people through ceremony and choice, but the adoption could also work in reverse. A Comanche could be adopted by another people, becoming a bridge between nations. Morrison looked confused and angry. What the devil are you talking about? I'm talking about making Margaret Henderson my daughter, Running Bear said calmly. Adopting her into the Comanche nation with all the rights and responsibilities that brings. Then she would have the legal standing under both white law and Indian custom to serve as guardian to my children, able to move between both worlds as they need. The proposal hit Margaret like a physical shock. She had expected many possible outcomes from this confrontation, but being adopted by a Comanche war chief had never been among them. That's absurd, the government official sputtered. A white woman can't just become an Indian. There are laws, procedures, documentation required. Your laws recognize Indian adoption customs when it suits you, Running Bear replied with cold precision. When you want to claim jurisdiction over Indian children taken by white families, you cite the primacy of blood relationships. Now, I claim the same right to create family bonds that transcend blood. Margaret realized that Running Bear was not just making an emotional gesture. He was using the government's own legal precedents against them, creating a situation that would be almost impossible to challenge in territorial courts. "But why would you do this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Running Bear looked at her with an expression that was both calculating and surprisingly gentle. "Because my children trust you. Because you risked everything to bring them home when you could have gained much by turning them over to your authorities. Because you understand what it means to be caught between worlds, and that understanding is what they will need to survive." He paused, his gaze moving to Joseph and Anna. "And because I am tired of war, tired of letting grief and anger make my decisions. My children have shown me that there might be another path, not the surrender that the white government wants, not the endless war that my warriors cry for, but something new." Anna stepped forward and took Margaret's hand. "Will you be our sister, Mother?" she asked. Using a Comanche phrase that Margaret somehow understood, meant something like stepmother or guardian. "Will you help us learn to live in both worlds without losing ourselves in either?" Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, the Comanche warriors who had followed their chief into this unprecedented situation, the government officials whose carefully laid plans were crumbling before their eyes, Morrison and his. Rangers who looked ready to resort to violence, and most importantly, the two children whose lives hung in the balance. "The territorial government will never accept this," she said finally. "The territorial government will have no choice," Running Bear replied. "If they refuse to recognize the adoption, they will be rejecting their own legal precedents. If they try to take the children by force from their legally recognized guardian, they will be committing kidnapping under their own laws." Morrison stepped forward, his patience finally exhausted. "This is all legal nonsense. I have orders to bring these children back, and that's what I'm going to do." His hand moved to his weapon. "Chief, order your warriors to stand down and surrender. The children, or face the consequences." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that could consume everything. Margaret could see Comanche warriors tensing, hands moving to weapons, the careful balance of the moment about to collapse into violence that would solve nothing and destroy many lives. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice carrying an authority she didn't know she possessed. "I am a citizen of Texas, with legal rights under territorial law. If Running Bear formally adopts me according to Comanche custom, and I accept guardianship of these children, then any attempt to take them from me without proper legal proceedings would be kidnapping." Morrison's face flushed red with anger. "You're not a lawyer, woman. You can't—" "Actually, she's correct," said a new voice from the edge of the gathering. Everyone turned to see a middle-aged man in a dusty suit riding into the encampment under a white flag. Margaret didn't recognize him, but Running Bear's expression suggested he did. "Judge William Patterson," the newcomer announced, dismounting from his horse. "Territorial Circuit Judge, recently arrived from Austin with some very interesting news about the legal status of mission children and government custody claims." The judge was a thin man with graying hair and the kind of measured demeanor that came from years of dealing with complex legal disputes on the frontier. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his authority was respected by all parties. "Judge Patterson," Morrison said warily, "what brings you to this gathering?" "Reports of a significant legal situation involving custody, disputes and potential violations of territorial law," Patterson replied calmly. "I came to ensure that any resolution follows proper legal procedures. He looked around the gathering, his gaze taking in the armed warriors, the tense officials, and the children at the center of it all. "I've spent the last week reviewing the relevant case law and precedents. The situation is more complex than anyone realized." Judge William Patterson, the newcomer announced, dismounting from his horse. Territorial Circuit Judge, recently arrived from Austin with some very interesting news about the legal status of mission children and government custody claims. The keen judge was a thin man with graying hair and the kind of measured demeanor that came from years of dealing with complex legal disputes on the frontier. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his authority was respected by all parties. "Judge Patterson," Morrison said warily, "what brings you to this gathering?" "Reports of a significant legal situation involving custody. Disputes and potential violations of territorial law," Patterson replied calmly. "I came to ensure that any resolution follows proper legal procedures." He looked around the gathering, his gaze taking in the armed warriors, the tense officials, and the children at the center of it all. "I've spent the last week reviewing the relevant case law and precedents. The situation is more complex than anyone realized." Patterson pulled a leather document case from his saddlebags and extracted several official-looking papers. "First, regarding the custody status of the children, known as Joseph and Anna Martinez. Investigation reveals that their placement at San Luis Mission was arranged by their natural father under a specific agreement that allowed for their return to him upon request." Morrison frowned. "That's not what our records show." "Your records are incomplete," the judge replied. "The original agreement signed by both Chief Running Bear and Father Sebastian at San Miguel Mission clearly stated that the children were being placed temporarily for education and medical care, with the understanding that they would be returned to their father when he deemed it appropriate." Margaret felt a surge of hope. The journal she had found at San Miguel had been more important than she realized. It contained evidence of the original agreement that had been deliberately suppressed by later officials. Furthermore, Judge Patterson continued, recent territorial legislation regarding Indian adoption customs specifically recognizes such ceremonies as legally valid when performed according to traditional protocols and witnessed by appropriate authorities. He looked directly at Running Bear. "Chief, if you wish to proceed with the adoption ceremony, I am authorized to witness it and provide the necessary legal documentation." Running Bear studied the judge for a long moment. "You would do this? Recognize a Comanche adoption of a white woman? The law is the law," Patterson replied simply. "My personal opinions are irrelevant. If the ceremony is conducted properly and all parties consent, then it becomes a legal fact, regardless of anyone's preferences." Margaret realized that this moment would change her life forever. If she accepted Running Bear's adoption, she would become legally Comanche while remaining a Texas citizen, a unique position that would allow her to serve as guardian to the twins and bridge between the two communities. But it would also make her a target for those who opposed any accommodation between settlers and Indians. She would be forever marked as someone who had chosen to cross racial lines, facing suspicion and hostility from many in her own community. "I accept," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent gathering. "I accept adoption into the Comanche Nation and guardianship of Swiftwater and Dancing Horse." Anna Swiftwater smiled for the first time since Margaret had known her. Joseph, Dancing Horse, stood straighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Running." Bear nodded slowly, then began to speak in Comanche, his words taking on the ritual cadences of the ceremony. Around them, the entire encampment fell silent, witnessing something that had never happened before in the history of either people. The adoption ceremony began at sunset, as Comanche tradition demanded for rituals that would fundamentally change someone's identity. Margaret found herself at the center of a circle formed by the entire encampment, with Running Bear standing beside her, and an elderly medicine woman named Singing Crow preparing the ritual elements. Judge Patterson stood at the edge of the circle, with his legal documents, ready to provide official witness to what was about to become the first legally recognized cross-cultural adoption in Texas territorial history. Captain Morrison and his men had withdrawn to the periphery of the gathering, clearly uncomfortable with the proceedings, but unable to intervene without violating territorial law. Singing Crow began the ceremony by burning sage and sweetgrass, the sacred smoke rising into the evening air as she chanted in the ancient Comanche tongue. Margaret felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, but also sensed something else, acceptance, beginning to replace suspicion among the warriors and families who had gathered to witness this unprecedented event. In the old days, Running Bear said, speaking in English so that the government witnesses could understand, adoption was how we brought new strength into our bands, captives who proved their worth, refugees who sought our protection, traders who earned our trust, all could become Comanche through ceremony and choice. He placed his hand on Margaret's shoulder, and she felt the solemnity of the moment settling around them like the smoke from Singing Crow's fire. Today we bring back the old way, not to make war, but to make peace. Margaret Henderson will become Margaret Running Bear, daughter of my heart if not my blood, with all the rights and responsibilities that brings. Singing Crow approached Margaret with a bowl of water mixed with earth from sacred ground, painting symbols on her forehead and hands while chanting prayers that Margaret couldn't understand but somehow felt in her bones. The medicine woman's weathered fingers were surprisingly gentle as she worked, her eyes holding a kindness that transcended language barriers. Swift Water and Dancing Horse. Margaret still thought of them as Anna and Joseph, though she was learning to use their Comanche names, stood nearby, watching the ceremony with expressions that mixed hope with anxiety. They were witnessing their two worlds being formally joined, creating a bridge they could cross without abandoning either side of their heritage. You will have a Comanche name, Running Bear announced. Singing Crow has consulted the spirits, and they have chosen Bridgewalker, one who can travel safely between distant places, bringing messages and understanding. Margaret Bridgewalker felt the rightness of the name settle into her consciousness. It captured not just what she was doing now, but what she had been unconsciously preparing for her entire life. Her Cherokee grandmother's stories, her father's acceptance of Indian neighbors, her own instinctive understanding of cultural boundaries, all had been leading to this moment. The ceremony continued with prayers, songs, and ritual exchanges that formally inducted Margaret into the Comanche nation. When it concluded, Judge Patterson stepped forward with his documents, creating the legal record that would make this spiritual transformation binding under territorial law. I hereby certify that Margaret Henderson, now Margaret Running Bear, has been formally adopted into the Comanche nation according to recognized tribal custom, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of territorial government. As such, she is entitled to all rights and responsibilities pertaining to tribal membership while retaining her status as a Texas citizen. He turned to another set of documents. Furthermore, I certify that guardianship of the children known as Swift Water and Dancing Horse, also called Anna and Joseph Martinez, has been legally transferred to Margaret Running Bear, their adoptive aunt under Comanche law and recognized guardian under territorial statute. Captain Morrison stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and frustration. Judge, this is a mockery of justice. These legal maneuvers don't change the facts. Those children are still valuable intelligence assets, and this woman is still guilty of interfering with government operations. Judge Patterson looked at Morrison with the patient expression of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult personalities. Captain, the children are now under legal guardianship that has been properly established and documented. Any attempt to remove them without proper court proceedings would constitute kidnapping under territorial law. And if Running Bear decides tomorrow that he wants his children back, what then? It was Running Bear himself who answered. Under Comanche law, children belong to their extended family, not just their parents. Bridgewalker is now family, with equal say in decisions about Swiftwater and Dancing Horse. Even I cannot override her guardianship without her consent. Margaret realized the full genius of what Running Bear had accomplished. By making her legally Comanche while she remained a Texas citizen, he had created an unassailable legal position that protected the children from being used as political pawns by either side. But the long-term implications were staggering. She would be living between two worlds more completely than she had ever imagined, responsible for two children who embodied the same cultural duality, while navigating the suspicions and hostilities of people on both sides who would question her loyalty. As if reading her thoughts, Swiftwater approached and took her hand. "Are you afraid?" the girl asked quietly. "Terrified," Margaret admitted, "but not of the responsibility. I'm afraid of letting you and your brother down, of not being wise enough to guide you through all the challenges ahead." Dancing Horse joined them, his serious young face showing a maturity that still sometimes surprised Margaret. Father Martinez used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite being afraid. "A wise priest," Running Bear said, overhearing. "Perhaps not all the mission teachings were bad, even if the methods were wrong." Judge Patterson finished his documentation and approached the small family group. "I should warn you," he said quietly. "This arrangement will face challenges. There are people in Austin who won't accept this precedent, who will look for ways to overturn or circumvent it." "Let them try," Running Bear replied. "This adoption was conducted according to traditions, older than their government, witnessed by a territorial judge and documented according to their own laws. Any challenge will have to overcome all of that." As night fell and the ceremony concluded, Margaret found herself sitting by a fire with her new family, trying to absorb the reality of what had just happened. In the space of a few hours, she had gone from being a single settler woman to being a Comanche daughter and the guardian of two children who represented the future of relations between their peoples. The practical implications were beginning to sink in. Where would they live? How would she support the children? What kind of education should they receive? How could she help them maintain connections to both cultures without forcing them to choose between them? "There is a place," Running Bear said, as if sensing her thoughts. "A ranch that was abandoned during the wars, about halfway between here and Cedar Ridge. Good land with water and buildings that could be repaired. It sits on the boundary between Comanche territory and settler lands, perfect for someone who must live in both worlds." Margaret knew the place he meant, the old Morrison Ranch, abandoned after a Comanche raid 3 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on her that Captain Morrison's own family's former home might become the residence for the children he was trying to capture. "The territorial government owns that land now," she pointed out. "Judge Patterson has assured me that arrangements can be made," Running Bear replied with a slight smile. "It seems the territory is very interested in supporting this experiment in peaceful coexistence." Over the following days, as the legal and practical details were sorted out, Margaret began to understand the full scope of what Running Bear had orchestrated. This wasn't just about saving his children. It was about creating a new model for relations between Indians and settlers, one based on cooperation rather than conflict. The abandoned ranch was indeed made available through territorial grant, with Margaret receiving clear title in exchange for her commitment to serve as a liaison between the Comanche bands and the settler communities. Swiftwater and Dancing Horse would attend school in Cedar Ridge during part of the year and live with their father's people during the summers, learning both languages and both ways of life. Captain Morrison had returned to Austin with his reports, but not before making it clear that he considered the entire arrangement a dangerous precedent that would come back to haunt the territory. The government officials had been more pragmatic, recognizing that they had achieved their goal of reducing tensions without having to resort to force or prolonged negotiations. But it was the reaction of Margaret's own community that surprised her most. When she finally returned to Cedar Ridge to collect her belongings and explain her new situation, she found a mixed reception that reflected the complexity of frontier attitudes toward racial boundaries. Her father, Samuel Henderson, had been the most difficult to convince. "You've thrown away your entire future," he said, his weathered face showing a mixture of anger and bewilderment. "For what? 2 Indian children who aren't even your blood?" "They are my family now," Margaret replied, simply. "And this isn't about throwing away my future, it's about building a different kind of future." Some of the settlers were openly hostile, viewing her adoption as a betrayal of her race and community. But others, particularly those who had lost family members to the ongoing conflicts, were cautiously hopeful that her arrangement might lead to lasting peace. "If it means my grandchildren can grow up without fearing Indian raids," said Martha Collins, whose husband had been killed in a Comanche attack 2 years earlier, "then I'm willing to see how this experiment works out." The most surprising support came from an unexpected source, Dutch Henry, the trader who had helped them during their flight north. "About time someone tried a new approach," he said, when Margaret stopped at his post to buy supplies for the ranch. "This war between settlers and Indians has gone on too long. Maybe it takes someone like you to show both sides there's another way." As autumn arrived, and Margaret settled into life at the ranch with Swiftwater and Dancing Horse, she began to see the fruits of Running Bear's vision. The children thrived in their dual existence, spending weekdays attending school in Cedar Ridge and weekends learning traditional skills from Comanche elders who visited the ranch. More importantly, the ranch became a meeting place where settlers and Indians could interact safely. Traders came to do business, negotiations were conducted, and gradually a new understanding began to develop between peoples who had been enemies for decades. Swiftwater proved to have a gift for languages, becoming fluent in Spanish as well as maintaining her English and recovering her childhood Comanche. Dancing Horse showed an aptitude for both traditional crafts and mechanical skills, able to repair farm equipment as easily as he could craft arrows. But perhaps the most significant change was in Running Bear himself. The grieving, angry war chief who had terrorized the frontier began to transform back into the thoughtful leader he had been before tragedy hardened his heart. With his children restored to him and a path toward peace opening before his people, he became an advocate for negotiation rather than warfare. "My children were lost to me because of lies and misunderstanding," he told a gathering of both settler and Comanche leaders at the ranch one evening. "But they were returned by truth and courage. Perhaps that is the lesson we all need to learn." Margaret listened to him speak, seeing in his words the hope for a future where children like Swiftwater and Dancing Horse wouldn't have to choose between worlds, but could help bridge them. The cave where she had first heard their cries seemed like a lifetime ago, but she understood now that those desperate voices calling for help had been calling for more than just rescue from rising water. They had been calling for rescue from a cycle of hatred and misunderstanding that had trapped 2 peoples in endless conflict. And in answering that call, Margaret had found not just a new family, but a new purpose that would define the rest of her life. The story that had begun with the sound of children crying in a dark cave had become the foundation for something unprecedented. In the history of the Texas frontier, a living example that peace between different peoples wasn't just possible, but could flourish when courage and compassion overcame fear and prejudice. 3 years had passed since the adoption ceremony at Eagle's Rest, and the ranch that had once been the Morrison homestead had transformed into something unprecedented in Texas frontier history. What had begun as an abandoned property scarred by violence had become a thriving center of cross-cultural exchange, known throughout the territory simply as the Bridge. Margaret stood on the porch of the main house on a crisp October morning, watching swift water teach a group of settler children how to weave grass baskets using traditional Comanche techniques. The 15-year-old had grown into a remarkable young woman, equally comfortable discussing Shakespeare with the schoolmaster in Cedar Ridge and preparing medicine with Comanche healers during her summer stays with Running Bear's band. Nearby, Dancing Horse was working with 2 young men from town to repair a wagon wheel, his skilled hands moving between traditional bone tools and modern metal implements with equal facility. At 16, he had developed into a natural diplomat, able to speak for both cultures with authority that men twice his age respected. The success of their arrangement had attracted attention far beyond the local area. Territorial officials had begun using the bridge as a model for other frontier settlements, and Margaret found herself hosting a steady stream of visitors, government representatives, missionaries, traders, and scholars, all trying to understand how such an unlikely experiment in coexistence had not only survived, but flourished. But success had also brought new challenges. The peaceful years had allowed both children to grow into their unique positions between worlds, but they were also approaching ages where they would need to make their own choices about marriage, careers, and ultimately, which community would claim their primary loyalty. Margaret was contemplating these complexities when she noticed a familiar figure riding up the main trail to the ranch. Judge William Patterson, now considerably grayer than he had been during the adoption ceremony, dismounted from his horse with the careful movements of a man feeling his years. "Judge Patterson," Margaret called out, walking down from the porch to greet him. "This is an unexpected pleasure. What brings you all the way out here?" Patterson's expression was more serious than usual as he accepted her offered cup of coffee and settled into one of the chairs on the porch. "I'm afraid I bring news that may complicate your peaceful existence here, Margaret. There have been developments in Austin that could affect the legal status of your guardianship." Margaret felt a familiar chill of apprehension. "What kind of developments?" "Texas is moving towards statehood," Patterson explained. "The territorial government is being replaced by a state constitution and new legal framework. There are those who see this transition as an opportunity to revisit certain arrangements that were made under territorial authority." The implications hit Margaret immediately. The legal precedents that had protected her unusual family structure had been established under territorial law. If Texas became a state with different legal foundations, those precedents might not carry the same weight. Senator Marcus Bradley from Austin has been particularly vocal about what he calls irregular arrangements with hostile Indians, Patterson continued. He's building political support for legislation that would require all children of Indian parentage to be placed in government-supervised institutions for their own protection and proper education. Margaret's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "Even children who are thriving in their current situations, especially those children," Patterson said grimly. "Bradley argues that your success proves these children can be civilized, and therefore they should be removed from all Indian influence and placed in proper Christian institutions where they can become fully American." Swiftwater had approached quietly during their conversation, her keen intelligence immediately grasping the significance of what she was hearing. "They want to take us away again," she said, her voice carefully controlled, but with underlying steel that reminded Margaret of Running Bear. They want to try, Patterson corrected, but they'll face significant legal obstacles. Your adoption into the Comanche nation was properly documented and witnessed. The guardianship arrangement has been successful by every measure. Any attempt to overturn it would require proving that the current arrangement is harmful to the children's welfare. Dancing Horse joined them, wiping grease from his hands after finishing the wagon repair. What does our father say about this threat? Patterson's expression grew even more grave. That's part of the problem. Running Bear has been meeting with other chiefs, including some who never fully accepted the peace arrangement. There are those among his own people who see this political threat as proof that whites can never be trusted, that any agreement will eventually be broken when it becomes inconvenient. Margaret understood the larger implications. If the legal arrangement that protected Swiftwater and Dancing Horse was overturned, it wouldn't just affect their family. It would shatter the fragile peace that had been built around their unique situation. Running Bear might be forced back into the role of war chief, leading his people in conflicts that would devastate both sides. There's more, Patterson continued. Captain Morrison has been appointed as a special advisor to Senator Bradley's committee. He's been arguing that your arrangement has been used by hostile Indians to gather intelligence about settler defenses and plans. That's absurd, Margaret said angrily. Morrison knows perfectly well that we've done nothing but work for peace between the communities. Morrison sees what he wants to see, Patterson replied, and what he wants to see is vindication for his long-held belief that any accommodation with Indians is ultimately dangerous to white settlers. Swiftwater had been listening with the intense concentration she brought to any serious discussion. Judge Patterson, what would happen if Dancing Horse and I chose to become full citizens of the United States? Would that protect us from being placed in government institutions? Patterson considered the question carefully. Possibly. If you could demonstrate complete assimilation into American society, if you renounced all connection to Comanche culture and identity, you might be able to claim protection under normal citizenship laws. But that would mean abandoning our father, Dancing Horse said quietly, abandoning everything that makes us who we are. It would also mean abandoning the bridge you've helped build between your peoples, Margaret added. You two have become symbols of the possibility for peace. If you disappear into full assimilation, that symbol disappears with you. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Margaret looked up to see a group of riders cresting the hill that overlooked the ranch, not the usual peaceful visitors who came for trade or negotiation, but armed men moving with military precision. Morrison, Margaret said grimly, recognizing the captain's erect posture even at a distance. Patterson stood quickly. He's not supposed to be here without proper legal authorization. The guardianship arrangement specifically protects against unauthorized interference. But as the riders drew closer, Margaret could see that Morrison wasn't alone. Accompanying him were several men in civilian clothes who had the look of government officials, plus a figure that made her blood run cold. A man in the black robes of a federal marshal. They've brought a federal marshal, she told Patterson. That means they have federal authority, not just territorial. Swiftwater and Dancing Horse had moved to stand on either side of Margaret, and she could feel their tension as they watched. The approaching riders. These children had learned early that official visitors often meant separation and loss. Morrison dismounted first, his expression showing the satisfaction of a man who believed he was finally achieving long-delayed justice. Margaret Running Bear, he said, using her adopted name with obvious distaste. I have a federal warrant for the custody of the minor children in your care. The federal marshal stepped forward, a lean man with cold eyes and the kind of methodical manner that came from years of enforcing unpopular laws. Marshal Thomas Crawford, he introduced himself. I have orders from the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs to take custody of the children known as Swiftwater and Dancing Horse, also called Anna and Joseph Martinez, for placement in the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. Margaret felt the world tilting around her. Carlisle was infamous throughout Indian country as a place where native children were sent to have their culture systematically destroyed, where they were forbidden to speak their languages, practice their customs, or maintain any connection to their tribal heritage. You have no authority here, Judge Patterson said firmly. These children are under legal guardianship established by territorial court and recognized by federal precedent. Marshal Crawford produced a set of official documents. The Bureau of Indian Affairs has determined that all children of Indian parentage must be removed from situations where they might be influenced by savage customs or divided loyalties. This is for their own protection and for the security of American settlements. These children are American citizens, Margaret protested. They've been baptized, educated in American schools, and have demonstrated complete loyalty to American laws and customs, which proves they can be fully civilized if removed from corrupting influences, Morrison interjected. Senator Bradley's committee has determined that your arrangement, while well-intentioned, has prevented these children from achieving their full potential as American citizens. Swiftwater stepped forward, her young voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from deep conviction. Marshal Crawford, I am 16 years old enough to speak for myself in most legal matters. I refuse to go with you. Your preferences are not relevant, Crawford replied coldly. You are a minor child of Indian parentage, subject to federal guardianship regardless of other arrangements. Dancing Horse joined his sister. And I am nearly 17. In most territories, that makes me old enough to make my own legal decisions, not when those decisions involve rejecting the civilizing influence that the federal government is offering you, Morrison said. You children don't understand what's best for your futures. Margaret could see the situation spiraling toward confrontation, but she also noticed something else. Dust clouds rising from several directions around the ranch, indicating that other parties were approaching rapidly. The peaceful isolation of the bridge was about to be shattered by forces beyond their control. Judge Patterson, she said quietly, what are our legal options? Patterson was studying the federal documents with the careful attention of a man who understood that lives hung in the balance. The federal warrant appears to be properly executed, he said finally, but there are procedural questions that could be challenged in court. We don't have time for court challenges, Crawford said, impatiently. I have orders to deliver these children to the railway station in Austin by tomorrow evening. They'll be on a train to Pennsylvania the following morning. The dust clouds Margaret had noticed were resolving into distinct groups of riders converging on the ranch from multiple directions. From the south came what appeared to be additional federal officials or military personnel. From the north, she could see the distinctive silhouettes of Comanche warriors in full war regalia. Running Bear had not been idle while government officials planned their legal maneuvers. He was bringing his own response to this threat against his children. Marshal Crawford, Margaret said, her voice carrying a calm she didn't feel. I think you should know that you're about to be surrounded by several hundred Comanche warriors who take a very personal interest in the welfare of these children. Crawford looked around nervously as the approaching riders became more clearly visible. Are you threatening federal officers with Indian attack? I'm informing you of a situation that you need to understand before you proceed, Margaret replied. These children are not just my wards. They are the son and daughter of one of the most powerful war chiefs in the Comanche nation. Any attempt to remove them by force will be seen as an act of war. Morrison stepped forward aggressively. Let them come. We have federal authority and military backup. It's time these savages learned that the United States government cannot be intimidated. But even as he spoke, Margaret could see doubt creeping into Crawford's expression. The marshal was experienced enough to recognize that he was walking into a situation far more complex and dangerous than his orders had indicated. The sound of war drums began echoing across the hills surrounding the ranch, a rhythmic thunder that spoke of gathering forces and preparations for battle. Swiftwater and Dancing Horse stood straighter as they heard the drums, their Comanche heritage responding to sounds that called to something deep in their blood. Margaret realized that the next few hours would determine not just the fate of her adopted family, but the future of peace between Indians and settlers throughout Texas. The experiment in coexistence that had flourished at the bridge was about to face its ultimate test. The war drums fell silent as Running Bear rode into the ranch compound. At the head of 200 mounted Comanche warriors, their horses' hooves raising clouds of dust that seemed to darken the very air around the bridge. Marshal Crawford's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, but Judge Patterson quickly grabbed his arm. Any aggressive move now will start a war that will consume half of Texas, Patterson whispered urgently. Let them speak first. Running Bear dismounted with fluid grace, his weathered face showing no emotion as he surveyed the scene. Federal officials clutching their warrants, his children standing defiant beside their adopted mother, and the peaceful ranch that had become a symbol of possibility, now transformed into a potential battlefield. But it was Swiftwater who broke the tense silence, stepping forward to address her father in fluent Comanche. Her words carried across the compound with the clear authority of someone who had learned to speak for multiple worlds. She's telling him that we choose to face this crisis together as a family, Dancing Horse translated quietly for the officials who couldn't understand. She's asking him to trust us to find a solution that doesn't require bloodshed. Running Bear's response was equally formal, but Margaret could hear the pride in his voice as he looked at his daughter. When he switched to English, his words were directed not just at Swiftwater, but at everyone present. My daughter speaks with wisdom beyond her years, he said. She reminds me that this ranch was built on the idea that different peoples can find ways to live together without destroying each other. But she also reminds me that some fights cannot be avoided when children are threatened. Marshal Crawford stepped forward, his voice tight with nervous authority. Chief Running Bear, I have federal orders to take custody of these children. Any interference with federal law enforcement will be considered an act of rebellion against the United States government. And I have the sacred duty of a father to protect his children from harm, Running Bear replied calmly. You're Carlisle. School is known among my people as a place where children go to die, not in body, perhaps, but in spirit, in memory, in everything that makes them who they are. Margaret watched the confrontation unfold, her mind racing through possibilities. The legal protections that had safeguarded their family were crumbling under federal pressure. But she began to see another approach, one that might preserve not just Swiftwater and Dancing Horse, but the larger experiment in peaceful coexistence that the bridge represented. Marshal Crawford, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. Before you execute your warrant, I have a legal challenge to present. Crawford looked annoyed. Mrs. Running Bear, I don't have time for more legal delays. You'll make time for this one, Judge Patterson interjected, understanding immediately what Margaret was attempting. Under federal law, any citizen has the right to present evidence that might affect the execution of a federal warrant. Margaret walked to the center of the compound, positioning herself where everyone, federal officials, Comanche warriors, and the growing crowd of settlers who had arrived to witness the confrontation, could hear her clearly. 3 years ago, everyone said that peace between Indians and whites was impossible, she began. They said that children caught between two cultures would be forever damaged. unable to find their place in either world. They said that any attempt at accommodation would end in violence and betrayal. She gestured toward Swiftwater and Dancing Horse, who stood with quiet dignity despite the chaos surrounding them. These young people have proved all of those predictions wrong. They speak 3 languages fluently. They've mastered both traditional Comanche skills and modern American education. They've served as translators, negotiators, and teachers, helping to prevent countless conflicts between our communities. Captain Morrison stepped forward impatiently. Pretty speeches don't change the law, woman. These children need proper American education, not this hybrid nonsense you've created. What we've created, Margaret continued, ignoring Morrison's interruption, is something unprecedented in American history. A generation of young people who can serve as bridges between cultures, instead of being forced to choose sides in conflicts they didn't create. She turned to address Marshal Crawford directly. Sir, you have orders to take these children to Carlisle School to make them into proper Americans. But I submit that they are already more American than most citizens. They embody the fundamental American ideal of unity from diversity. Swiftwater stepped forward, her young voice carrying the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. Marshal Crawford, may I ask you a question? Crawford looked uncomfortable, but nodded. What exactly do you hope to accomplish by sending us to Pennsylvania? What will we learn there that we haven't already learned here? You'll learn to be proper American citizens, Crawford replied, to put aside savage customs and embrace civilized society. Dancing Horse joined his sister. Sir, I can read and write in 3 languages. I can repair modern machinery and craft traditional tools with equal skill. I understand both the U.S. Constitution and Comanche law. How will forgetting half of my knowledge make me a better American citizen? The questions hung in the air, and Margaret could see doubt creeping into Crawford's expression. The Marshal was intelligent enough to recognize that the standard arguments for Indian education didn't quite apply to these remarkable young people. But it was an unexpected voice that provided the breakthrough Margaret had been hoping for. From the group of federal officials who had accompanied Crawford, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit stepped forward. Marshal Crawford, I believe there may be alternatives worth considering. Crawford turned in surprise. Commissioner Williams, I thought you were here to observe the execution of the warrant. Commissioner Williams, who Margaret now realized was a high-ranking official in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, looked around the scene with the calculating gaze of a politician sensing opportunity. I was, Williams said carefully, but I'm also here to evaluate the success of various approaches to Indian education and assimilation. What I'm seeing here suggests that perhaps we've been thinking about this problem in too narrow terms. He approached Swiftwater and Dancing Horse, studying them with obvious interest. Young lady, young man, you've been living between 2 cultures for several years now. In your judgment, which approach has been more effective at preparing you for success in American society? Your time at the mission school or your time here at this ranch? Swiftwater answered without hesitation. Here, sir, at the mission, we learn to recite lessons and follow rules. Here, we learn to think, to solve problems, to bring different kinds of knowledge together, to find new solutions. And you, young man? Williams asked Dancing Horse. The same, sir. At the mission, we were taught that we had to choose between being Indian or being American. Here we learned that we could be both, and that being both made us more valuable to both communities. Williams nodded thoughtfully, then turned to address Running Bear. Chief, if I were to propose an alternative to Carlisle School, one that allowed your children to remain here, while also satisfying federal requirements for Indian education, would you be willing to consider it? Running Bear's expression remained guarded, but Margaret could see interest flickering in his eyes. What kind of alternative? A federal pilot program, Williams said. his voice gaining confidence as he developed the idea in real time. Using this ranch as a model for a new approach to Indian education, one that preserves cultural knowledge while providing modern skills. Your children could serve as the first graduates and eventually as teachers for other Indian children. Margaret felt her heart racing as she understood the implications. Williams was offering to transform the bridge from a private experiment into an official federal program, one that could protect Swiftwater and Dancing Horse while also extending their model to help other Native American children. It would require federal oversight, Williams continued, regular inspections, standardized curricula, and documented results. But if successful, it could become the foundation for a new policy approach that preserves what's valuable in Indian cultures while preparing children for success in modern America. Captain Morrison stepped forward angrily. "Commissioner, this is exactly the kind of soft approach that's failed everywhere it's been tried. These people need firm discipline, not accommodation." "Captain Morrison," Williams replied with the authority of superior rank, "this approach hasn't failed. It's succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Look around you. This ranch has achieved more genuine peace between Indians and whites than all your military campaigns combined." Judge Patterson stepped forward, sensing the political shift in the conversation. "Commissioner Williams, if such a program were established, what would be the legal status of the children currently under Mrs. Running Bear's guardianship?" "They would become federal scholarship students," Williams said, "with Mrs. Running Bear serving as their official guardian and primary instructor under federal contract. The program would be funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and overseen by regular federal inspections." Margaret realized that Williams was offering them everything they needed: legal protection for the children, federal recognition of their educational approach, and resources to expand their work to help other Native American families. But the offer came with strings attached. Federal oversight meant federal control, and federal control meant that their experiment in cultural bridge building would be subject to the political winds that blew through Washington. "What guarantees would we have?" Running Bear asked carefully. "That this program wouldn't be changed or discontinued when political priorities shift?" Williams was honest in his response. "No absolute guarantees, Chief, but successful programs tend to survive political changes, especially when they produce results that benefit everyone involved." Swiftwater and Dancing Horse had been listening to the adult negotiations with the intense attention of young people whose futures were being decided. Now Swiftwater stepped forward again. "Commissioner Williams, would this program allow other children like us to stay with their families while receiving education? Children who wouldn't have to choose between their heritage and their future?" "That would be the goal," Williams confirmed, "to create a model that could be replicated at other locations, allowing Indian children to maintain family connections while acquiring modern skills." Dancing Horse nodded slowly. "Then we accept, not just for ourselves, but for all the children who might benefit from what we've learned here." Margaret felt tears of pride and relief as she watched the young people take control of their own destiny. They were choosing not just their personal future, but embracing the responsibility of serving as examples for others facing the same cultural conflicts. Running Bear looked at his children for a long moment, then at Margaret, then at the federal officials who were offering this unprecedented opportunity. "If my children agree, and if Bridgewalker agrees to continue as their guardian and teacher, then the Comanche Nation will support this program." Marshal Crawford looked confused and slightly frustrated. "Commissioner, what about my warrant?" "My orders were specific. Your orders were to ensure that these children received proper American education," Williams replied. "This program will accomplish that goal more effectively than Carlisle School, while also serving broader federal interests in Indian relations." The federal warrant was formally suspended pending the establishment of the pilot program, and within Hours. The atmosphere at the bridge had transformed from potential battleground back to its usual role as a meeting place for different cultures. As the various groups dispersed, federal officials returning to Austin to draft program proposals, Comanche warriors riding back to their camps with news of this unexpected victory, settlers returning to their homes with stories of peaceful resolution instead of renewed warfare. Margaret found herself standing on the ranch porch with Swift, Water and Dancing Horse, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Do you think it will work?" Swiftwater asked quietly. "This federal program, the expansion to other children, do you think we can really make a difference?" Margaret looked at the young woman who had grown from a terrified child in a flooded cave into a confident bridge builder capable of speaking for multiple worlds. "I think," she said slowly, "that you've already made more difference than you realize. The question now is how far that difference will spread." Dancing Horse, ever practical, was already thinking ahead. "We'll need to develop curricula that satisfy federal requirements while preserving cultural knowledge. We'll need to train other teachers who understand both worlds. We'll need to convince families on both sides that this approach can work." "All challenges we can meet," Margaret said with quiet confidence. "We've already proved that the impossible is possible. Now we just have to help others believe it too." Years later, when historians looked back on the transformation of Indian education policy in late 19th century America, they would trace its origins to an unlikely source. Two children rescued from a flooded cave by a woman who refused to accept that different peoples couldn't find ways to live together. The Bridge Ranch became the first of dozens of similar programs, places where Native American children could maintain their cultural connections while acquiring modern skills. Swiftwater became the first Native American woman to earn a federal teaching certificate, eventually directing educational programs throughout the Southwest. Dancing Horse pioneered engineering techniques that combined traditional knowledge with modern technology, helping to build infrastructure that served both Indian and white communities. But perhaps most importantly, their story became proof that individual acts of courage and compassion could change the course of history. Margaret's decision to rescue two crying children from a cave had grown into a movement that transformed how America thought about cultural diversity and education. The sound of children's voices no longer echoed from dark caves, calling desperately for help. Instead, those voices could be heard in classrooms and meeting halls, on ranches and in town squares, speaking multiple languages and building bridges between worlds that had once seemed forever divided. And at the heart of it all remained the simple truth that Margaret had discovered that morning by the Brazos River, that children are just children regardless of their heritage, and that helping them find their place in the world is perhaps the most important work any adult can undertake. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.